Hello and welcome back to the next video in our series where we are exploring the VBA program language. In today's video, we are going to cover a very important topic related to programming, and that topic is variables. So we will find that with variables, it provides us a new framework for basically storing important pieces of information. And then at any point in our script, if we want to reference that piece of information, we can do so in an easy to use fashion. So the first section is we're going to talk about kind of the variables as a concept and some key definitions that we have to understand. And then we'll proceed into the actual VBA editor itself and we'll walk through some examples. So let's get into it. So the first thing that we need to talk about is what exactly are variables? Well, I provided definition on the left-hand side, and I'll read through it, and then we'll kind of walk through different parts of it. So, variables are used to store information to be referenced and manipulated in a computer program. They also provide a way of labeling data with a descriptive name so our programs can be understood more clearly by the reader and ourselves. It is helpful to think of variables as containers that hold different pieces of information. Their sole purpose is to label and store data in memory. So really, what can we think of as variables? Well, say we had this important piece of information in our script and we want to be able to store that piece of information somewhere until we need it later on. Well, we would use a variable in that situation. So basically what we would do is we would create a variable, which is in a sense like a container, and then we would assign some value to that container. Now, along with being a container where it's actually storing something, it's actually a labeled container. So we can actually put some context as to what is inside that container. That might not seem like a big deal, but that's a very big deal. Imagine if you didn't have that label. You would, in a sense, have a bunch of containers where you couldn't actually see what's inside of them, but you could only say that it's a container. But by providing a label, you can give some context as to what is inside that container. So not a difficult concept to understand, but a very important concept. So that's why kind of the labeling aspect is very important when it's related to variables. To declare a variable in VBA, the first thing that we need to do is pass through the dim keyword, so the dim statement, and then we pass through the variable name itself, and we'll talk about how to name our variables. Next is as, and then finally we pass through the data type. So in this case, I'm declaring a string data type to my variable. And then finally, if I want to assign a value to my variable, I call the variable name again, pass through the equal sign, and then finally, I pass through the content that I want to store in that variable. So this is how we would explicitly declare our variables. By explicitly, I mean we are defining the data type of our variable. So we'll explain that more in detail later on. There are a ton of advantages of why we'd want to use variables. I'm going to run through a couple, but you should always declare your variables. You should always declare the data type of your variables because that is going to set you up for success when you're building your programs. One of the advantages to using variables is we get access to a feature in IntelliSense. So IntelliSense is an integrated tool in VBA that basically helps us write code. So it will make recommendations on how to complete a particular line of code. When we create a variable, it will store that name in IntelliSense. And whenever we start trying to type that variable name, VBA will catch on to the pattern and say, hey, you probably mean to just type out this entire variable name. Well, let me do that for you. So all you have to do is press tab or click the button and it will complete that line for you. So it saves us time when we're writing our lines of code. And by declaring our variables, we can store that name in IntelliSense. The next advantage to using variables is we can specify the type of information in a variable. Now, the type of information I'm talking about here is the data type. So I can specify whether my variable contains a string or a numerical value. Now, data types are an important concept in programming also, so I've actually dedicated an entire video to data types. But all we need to know at this juncture is that when we specify the data type of our variables, we are kind of setting ourselves up on the types of operations that we can perform on that particular variable. But that will make more sense in the next video. The next advantage to using variables is we get access to an error checking tool in VBA. So when we declare our variables, we can specify the data type. And then later in our code, if we assign a value to our variable that doesn't match the data type that we declared the variable as, then VBA will pass through a message saying, wait a minute, something's wrong here. You declared a variable up above as an integer, but now here you are trying to assign a string to it. You probably don't mean to do that. Let me tell you that, and then that way you can fix your code. So it helps us by stopping us from making that error. The next advantage to using variables is when it comes to debugging. Say something goes wrong in your code and it was related to your variable, and you need to trace back at each line of your code where your variable was. Well, imagine if you didn't have a label. It would be very difficult to do that. You would just basically see a number there, but you wouldn't have any context as to what that number is. Is it this variable or is it that variable? By having those labels, you can trace back. You can see, okay, I did this operation at this point. Maybe that's where something went wrong. So it just allows for the debugging process to go a lot smoother because we can easily trace back all the different steps that we took with that variable. So something else that we need to discuss when we declare variables is we have to specify how accessible we want to make our variables. We can think of this accessibility as the scope of our variables. So for example, if I create a variable, do I plan to use this variable in other modules in my project? Do I plan to use it in other procedures in my particular module, or do I just plan to use it within a particular procedure? This is getting into the world of scope. And we can define the scope of our variable, and by defining the scope, we can define how accessible we want this variable to be across our VBA project. At the highest level, we can make it globally accessible. So we would use the public keyword, and when we declare a public variable, we can use it across any module within our particular VBA project. If we want to restrict our variable to a particular module, then we would use the private keyword, and then we can use that variable across any of our procedures in that module. Now, if we want to restrict it even further to the lowest level, we can restrict it to a particular procedure, and we would use the static or dim keyword in that situation, and that would restrict it to the actual procedure itself. So now that we understand variable scopes, let's look at it in a more visual manner. Now, at the highest level, we can have a public variable. So that means at an entire project level. At the next level, we can have it accessible across an entire module. So in that case, we would use the private keyword. And then next, if we want to restrict our variable to just a particular procedure, then we would use the static or dim keyword. Something else that we have to discuss is naming our variables. So we've been given this framework where we can label our information. We want to make sure that we use this framework properly. And what I mean by that is we want our variables to make sure that they have unambiguous names. So we want to be able to clearly tell the reader what is inside that variable and how they can think about the information inside that variable. Now, when it comes to naming variables, we'll find that there are kind of two groups of rules. Some of them are hard rules. So if we break those rules, we will commit a syntax error. And then some of them are soft rules. So even if we break them, it won't commit a syntax error, but it's not necessarily setting us up for success later in our program. Some of the hard rules that we have to follow is, for example, we cannot have the first character in our variable name be a number. So the first character cannot be a numerical character. That will return a syntax error. I cannot have spaces in my variable name. That will also commit a syntax error. I cannot use Excel reserved keywords as a variable name. So in VBA, for example, there is a keyword called string, and that specifies the data type of a variable. I cannot use string as a variable name. The reason why is then VBA will get confused. Are you talking about the data type or are you talking about the variable now? So in order to stop that confusion from happening, we restrict access and we say, hey, you cannot name your variables after these special keywords in Excel VBA. Some other things that we have to keep in mind, we cannot use special characters. So this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just a Couple of the key characters that we can't use in our actual variable name. You can use an underscore. Underscores are allowed. The next thing is that our variables cannot exceed 255 characters in length. There's a bigger problem at hand if you are creating variables that are longer than 255 characters length. In fact, if you're doing anything really longer than 30 characters, it's probably a little bit too much. So we want to make sure that we write concise variable names, nothing that is extremely long. Some soft rules, so these are rules that won't return a syntax error, but it's not necessarily setting us up for success. We don't want to be ambiguous when we name our variables. So for example, my thing too. This is not giving me any context as to what is inside that variable. Is it a number? Is it a string? Is it, how do I think about this information inside my variable? What is it used for? Well, something that I could do is I could use a name. So in this situation, I'm saying it's a name, but I probably could be even a little bit more clear. I could say, well, it's actually the last name of a person, or maybe it's the full name of a person. Well, in this situation, I'm being very clear with how I'm communicating to the reader of specifying what is inside that variable. And we always want to make sure that we are clear and concise with our readers. So that way, when we look back at our code, we understand what is inside our variables. Another convention that you might see used when it comes to naming variables is that we will specify the data type in the name itself. This comes in handy when our code becomes very long. So if we have hundreds of lines of code, the last thing we want to do is scroll to the top to figure out what the data type is of that variable. What we can then do is we can just simply have the first 3 characters of our variable be specifying the data type. So for example, if I declare a variable and I specify the data type as long, then the first 3 characters in the variable name itself will be LNG. So this is a framework that you can follow if you so choose. So now that we've talked about variables, let's look at them in the VBA editor itself. So I currently have an Excel workbook open, and I have my VBA editor opened as well with some modules that I've created. And we're going to walk through these different modules to kind of reinforce the concepts that we've talked about. The first module that we're going to run through is how we declare variables. So there are 2 ways to declare a variable. There is an explicit way and an implicit way. When we explicitly declare our variables, we are specifying the data type of our variable. When we implicitly declare our variables, we are not specifying the data type. So for example, here, this is how I would explicitly declare my variable. I would use the dim keyword, pass through the variable name, as, and then the data type. And then if I want to assign a value to that variable, I would call the variable name, pass through the equal sign, and then pass through the content that I want to store in that variable. So this is explicitly declaring my variable because I specified the data type. If I want to implicitly declare my variable, here I'm just simply creating a new variable, last name, and then putting awesome in that variable. Now, even though I did not specify a data type will still be assigned to this variable, but it will be the default VBA data type, which is variant. Now, variant isn't a bad data type per se, but it's a costly one. It does take a bunch of memory in order to use it. And so if we have a bunch of variables where we don't specify the data type, we can actually have performance implications that happen in our VBA script. So we actually can have slower scripts because we are not specifying our data type. Now, I'll explain this concept more in the next video where we talk about data types, but at this juncture, please always declare your variables and specify the data types. Do not get into this habit. It will cause you trouble down the road. This is more of a side note, but sometimes you will see the let keyword before the variable when we're assigning a value to it, so either here or here. This is an optional keyword, so I think it's more just for readability, but keep in mind if you do see it, it's just kind of more for readability purposes, nothing special. It's only optional. You don't have to pass it through. So now that we know how to declare variables, let's see variable scopes. Now we know that the scope of a variable really just defines how accessible that variable is across my project. If I want my variable to be accessible across my entire project, then I want to use the public keyword. That will create a global scope. And then finally, if I want to restrict my variable to a particular module, then I would use the private keyword. To declare a public or private variable, I will declare my variable at the top of my module, so before any subroutine. And what I can do is I pass through the public or private keyword, the name of the variable, as, and then the data type. Now in this example, I've created two modules, and all these two modules are doing is assigning a value to those variables that we declared above. Now in this situation, I'm going to explore the actual private variable a little bit more in depth. So all this module is doing is running this one. So it's running this one where we're assigning the variable, and then I want to display that variable in a message box. Now keep in mind, I do not have this in my procedure. So even though it's not in my procedure, I should be able to still access it because I've declared it as a private scope. So I can access it from anywhere within this module. So let's run this and see what we get. I get 2000, just like I was expecting. So because I declared it as a private scope, I can access it from anywhere in this module. Let's look at a global variable. So in this example, I've kind of just rewrote the same two subroutines. I did the private one and then the public one. Now with the public one, this should also still work because again, it's a public variable. I can access it from anywhere within my VBA project. So when I run this, I can still see my variable. So even though I declared it in the other module, I can still access it from this module. However, with the private one, let's see what happens. I get a syntax error, variable not defined. That is because it's looking for a variable that it cannot see. So even though we know it exists in that other module variables, this module cannot see it. It cannot see that variable from there. So now that we know about the global and the private scope, let's look at a more localized scope. So with local variables, we can have two categories of them. One is a regular local variable, and the next one is a static local variable. So with a regular local variable, the value will reset after the subprocedure has finished running. And with a static local variable, it will maintain its value. So it will not reset after that procedure has finished running. Now, for me, I kind of got this concept when I was visually showing it, so I'm going to do the same with you guys. So what I want to do first is I want to run through this procedure. All I do is I create two variables, num1 and num2. They're both integers, but one is a regular local variable and one is a static local variable. And then for each of these variables, I simply add 1 to it, and I display that new value in a message box. So they both start out at 0, and then they both have 1 added to it, so they both should appear as 1 on the first run. So let's run this procedure. Okay, number 1, it's a value of 1, that makes sense. And then number 2 is a value of 1, so that makes sense too. But let's run it again and see what happens. Okay, so number 1 value is 1 again. That makes sense because it's a regular local variable, so it resets its value at the end of each run of the procedure. So this is 0 again, and then it's just adding 1. But now my static variable is a value of 2. It's because it didn't reset itself after the first run through. It kept its old value. It maintained it. It was static. It didn't change. So that's the advantage of a static variable. It doesn't reset itself after we finish running the procedure. If I wanted to reset a static variable, I have to close the workbook where the project is. And when I do that, it will reset a static variable. One final thing that I do want to mention is I did mention in IntelliSense, it kind of helps us write the code. So for example, if I go here and I scroll down to some of the variables that I declared, I have to remember where I put it. I think it was public. Yeah, perfect. So with here, I can see my variables in IntelliSense. So I can see this, and then if I just simply tab, it will populate that line of code for me. So that's what I was talking about with the feature of IntelliSense. It actually stores that variable name in IntelliSense, and then as we type code, if we ever reference the variable, we can just use that shortcut to auto-populate our line of code. So that does it for this video. If you have any questions about variables or any of the topics that we covered today, please put them down in the comments below. Don't feel bad if you didn't get this right away. This is a lot of information. I'm completely aware of that. I mean, I remember when I was learning about variables, it definitely took a couple tries to kind of understand these different things about scopes and just all this different things related to either a static or a regular variable. But as we do more examples, hopefully it's starting to stick a little bit more. But if I can help in any way, if I can answer a question or something like that, please put that down in the comment below and I'll try to walk you through it. Also, if you could make sure to like the video, that would help out a lot. When you like it, it's easier for other people to find it, and then so they can reference this video as well. And then finally, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos on different topics. But yeah, that finishes today's video. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks again, guys.